On the 27th of November 2017, the world was told a story. A prince had fallen in love. A former actress had said yes. Flashbulbs outside Kensington Palace, a ring made from his mother's diamonds, a couple laughing on a gravel path like they hadn't a care between them. That was the version released to the public. It was not the version that was happening behind the walls. For 7 months before that photograph was taken, a machine had already been in motion, a vetting process so thorough it would have unsettled most brides, staff reassignments inside the household that had nothing to do with wedding planning and everything to do with containment. And at least one closed-door meeting where the phrase used was not welcome to the family. It was manage the exposure. This is the story the palace didn't release, not the wedding. The 7 months before it, when an American actress with no royal training walked into the oldest surviving monarchy in the world, and the institution quietly decided, before she'd said a single public word, exactly how much of her it was going to allow the world to see. Think about what that means for a moment. Before Meghan Markle had given a single official interview as a royal fiancée, before she had cut a single ribbon, visited a single hospital ward, or stood beside Harry at a single public engagement, a team of people whose job existed specifically to protect the institution had already built a file on her, had already mapped the risks she posed, had already begun the quiet work of deciding which parts of her decade in public life could remain, and which parts needed to disappear before the cameras ever turned toward Kensington Palace's gates. This isn't a story about whether Harry and Meghan's love was real. By every account, it was. This is a story about what happens when that kind of love collides with an institution that has spent nearly 1,000 years perfecting a single skill above all others: control. Control of image. Control of narrative. Control of exactly how much of a human being the public is permitted to know. And what makes this story worth telling in full, not the sanitized wedding day version, but the real one, is that almost everything that would eventually break this marriage apart from the institution was already visible in those first 7 months, if you knew where to look. The warning signs weren't subtle. They were architectural. They were built into the very process by which Meghan Markle was allowed to become part of this family in the first place. By the end of this story, you'll understand why an Oprah interview 4 years later, watched by 17 million people, wasn't really a bombshell. It was the inevitable conclusion of a process that began the moment palace officials first sat down to ask not who is this woman, but how much of a problem is she going to be? Let's go back to where it started. Every documentary about this marriage tends to start with the wedding, or with the Oprah interview, because those are the moments everyone remembers. But if you actually want to understand why this family broke apart, not just that it did, but why, specifically in the way that it did, you have to start earlier. You have to start with a file that was opened on an American actress before the world knew her name. Before we get to the meeting itself, it's worth sitting for a moment with exactly what the institution means in a story like this. Because it is not, despite how the phrase sounds, a single villain sitting behind a desk somewhere in Buckingham Palace, twirling a pen and deciding the fate of a prince's love life. It is something both more diffuse and, in its way, more powerful than that. A centuries-old accumulation of habit, precedent, protocol, and institutional self-preservation instinct distributed across dozens of private secretaries, communications officers, protection commanders, and family members, each acting according to a shared, largely unspoken understanding of what the monarchy needs in order to survive into the next generation. That understanding was forged, in its modern form, largely in the crucible of the 20th century through the abdication crisis of 1936, when King Edward VIII gave up the throne rather than abandon his relationship with the American divorce Wallis Simpson, an event that taught the institution in the starkest possible terms. That individual romantic desire could not be permitted to threaten the stability of the crown itself. It was reinforced again more painfully and more recently by the collapse of Charles and Diana's marriage in the 1990s and by Diana's subsequent death, an event that taught the institution a second, equally hard lesson that the press, once fully unleashed on a compelling human story involving a member of the royal family, could not be reliably controlled once it was set in motion, and that the only real defense was to control the story before the press ever got hold of it. Every senior royal alive in 2016, when Harry first met Meghan, had been shaped by one or both of these institutional memories. The Queen herself had reigned through the entire Charles and Diana saga, watching it play out in real time, from the fairy tale wedding of 1981 to the devastating three of us in this marriage interview of 1995 to the funeral cortege of 1997 that drew an estimated 2.5 billion television viewers worldwide. Prince Charles had lived through it as a participant, not merely an observer. His own private life dissected, his own affair with Camilla Parker Bowles exposed and endlessly rehashed, his own reputation, for a period of years following Diana's death, at one of its lowest points in public esteem in modern royal history. And Harry himself, as we'll see throughout this story, had lived through it as a child, watching his mother's face on tabloid front pages before he was old enough to fully understand what he was looking at, and then losing her entirely to the machine those front pages represented. This is the institutional memory Meghan Markle was walking into, unknowingly, on that first blind date in the summer of 2016. Not simply a family. A defense structure built and rebuilt across nearly a century of crisis, whose primary and overriding function, whatever warmth or genuine affection might exist alongside it, was self-preservation. It's worth noting, too, that this institutional memory was not abstract history to the people making decisions in 2016 and 2017. Several of the senior courtiers involved in Meghan's early vetting had themselves worked within the household during the final years of Diana's life, or in the immediate aftermath of her death, and carried personal first-hand memory of exactly how catastrophically the previous attempt at managing a compelling, independently minded royal outsider had gone. That personal history is not an excuse for how Meghan was subsequently treated, but it helps explain the sheer intensity and thoroughness of the response. This was not bureaucratic overcaution for its own sake. It was, from the perspective of the people executing it, a matter of genuinely believing they were preventing history from repeating itself, even as their methods for doing so ultimately became the very thing that made a version of that repetition unavoidable. To understand what happened in those 7 months, you have to understand how Prince Harry met Meghan Markle in the first place, because even the meeting itself was managed long before the public ever heard about it. The introduction came through a mutual friend, a London-based associate who ran in circles that overlapped both worlds: Harry's post-military social scene and the entertainment industry orbit Meghan moved through as a working actress on the television series Suits. The specifics of that first meeting, in July 2016, were mundane by royal standards, a blind date arranged with the kind of casualness that belongs to ordinary people, not to the fifth in line to the British throne. No protection officers stationed outside, no advanced security sweep of the venue, no briefing document prepared in advance about the woman he was about to meet. For one evening at least, Harry got to do what almost no adult member of the British royal family had done in living memory: meet someone new without an institutional apparatus already watching. That would not last long. To understand why, you have to understand what Harry had already lived through by the time he sat down across from Meghan Markle in the summer of 2016. He was 31 years old. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, one as a forward air controller calling in airstrikes, the second flying Apache helicopters, a level of frontline military service unmatched by any senior royal in generations. He had spent his entire adult life inside a security bubble so total that ordinary experiences most people take for granted. Walking into a bar unnoticed, exchanging numbers with a stranger, going on a first date without wondering whether it would end up as a tabloid headline by morning, simply did not exist for him. And running beneath all of it, shaping every instinct he had about relationships, publicity, and trust, was the death of his mother. Princess Diana had died in a Paris underpass in August 1997, in a car being pursued by photographers while Harry was 12 years old. The trauma of that loss, and, more specifically, the trauma of understanding, even as a child, that the press pursuit of his mother had been a direct contributing factor in the crash that killed her, became the defining lens through which Harry would view every subsequent relationship with the media for the rest of his life. Friends and biographers alike would later describe a man who carried, permanently, an almost visceral fear of watching history repeat itself, of falling in love with someone only to watch the press machine that killed his mother turn its focus onto her. That fear had already shaped and damaged 2 prior relationships by the time Meghan entered the picture. To fully appreciate the weight Harry carried into every relationship of his adult life, it's worth revisiting, briefly, the specific mechanics of what happened to his mother, because the parallel would become almost eerily direct in the years that followed his introduction to Meghan. Princess Diana, in the final years of her life, had become perhaps the single most photographed woman on earth. A level of press pursuit so intense and so constant that she rarely, if ever, moved through public space without a phalanx of photographers following her every movement. On the night of August 31st, 1997, that pursuit culminated in a high-speed chase through the streets of Paris, ending in a crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel that killed Diana, her companion Dodi Fayed, and their driver Henri Paul. Harry was 12 years old, staying at Balmoral with his father and brother, when he was woken in the early hours of the morning and told his mother had died. He has spoken, in interviews and in his memoir, about the surreal, almost dissociative quality of the days that followed, walking behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London at the age of 12, in full view of a global television audience, expected to maintain a composed, dignified public face while processing, privately, one of the most devastating losses imaginable. He has described the lasting psychological impact of that experience in stark terms: a persistent, at times debilitating anxiety around press attention, and a recurring nightmare, which he has discussed candidly in therapy sessions he has spoken about publicly, of watching history repeat itself around someone else he loved. That inherited trauma is not incidental background to this story. It is, in many ways, the emotional engine driving nearly every major decision Harry would go on to make regarding Meghan, the extraordinary November 2016 statement condemning press harassment, the eventual decision to step back from royal life entirely, rather than watch his wife endure a version of what his mother endured, and the relentless legal battles against tabloid publications he has pursued in the years since. Cases that Harry has explicitly and repeatedly framed in his own public statements as unfinished business connected directly to his mother's death. Chelsea Davy, a Zimbabwean-born law student Harry dated on and off for roughly 7 years beginning in 2004, had been subjected to a level of press intrusion so aggressive, reporters camped outside her university halls. Photographers following her on nights out, tabloid speculation about her family's business dealings in Zimbabwe, that those close to her would later describe the relationship's slow unraveling as less a matter of incompatibility than of simple exhaustion. Davy herself, in rare public comments years later, described the period as one that left her wary of public life altogether, retreating from the spotlight almost entirely once the relationship ended for good around 2011. Cressida Bonas, whom Harry dated between 2012 and 2014, fared little better under the same institutional and media pressure. An aspiring actress and dancer from an aristocratic but not conventionally wealthy family, Bonas found herself similarly hounded, press camped outside her home, tabloid profiles picking apart her family history, intense public speculation about an engagement that never came. When the relationship ended in 2014, friends close to Bonas described relief as much as heartbreak, relief that she was. Finally, released from a level of scrutiny she had never sought and had struggled, visibly, to endure. Both women, in other words, had been treated by the palace's protective and communications apparatus less as future family members than as risks requiring management, variables whose exposure to the press needed to be minimized, monitored, and where possible controlled. Neither relationship had survived that treatment. It's worth dwelling for a moment on what that treatment actually looked like in practice, because the pattern established with Chelsea Davy and Cressida Bonas is the same pattern that would later be applied in far more elaborate form to Meghan. With Davy, protection officers reportedly maintained detailed logs of her movements whenever she visited the UK, coordinated with her university's own security to manage press presence around her halls of residence, and on at least one occasion intervened directly with a photo agency to negotiate the suppression of images considered too revealing or embarrassing. With Bonas, whose family had genuine but modest aristocratic connections, the vetting process reportedly extended to assessing her family's finances and her own career ambitions as a dancer and actress, with some courtiers reportedly expressing private skepticism about whether a woman pursuing her own independent creative career could adequately subordinate that career to the demands of royal life, precisely the same tension in miniature that would later define years of internal debate about Meghan. Neither Davy nor Bonas, however sympathetic their individual experiences, had presented anything close to the scale of complexity Meghan represented. Davy's family, while wealthy by ordinary standards, had no meaningful independent media profile of their own. Bonas's acting career, while genuine, had never approached the level of mainstream visibility Meghan had achieved through 7 seasons of an internationally distributed television drama. Neither woman had ever given a magazine interview discussing her views on feminism or racial identity. Neither had a personal media platform with an independent readership numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The institution's containment apparatus, built and refined across these 2 prior relationships, was about to be tested against a partner whose scale of pre-existing public identity dwarfed anything it had previously had to manage. And by the time Harry met Meghan Markle in 2016, that pattern, containment as the default institutional response to any serious relationship in his life, was not a hypothesis. It was an established, repeatedly confirmed operating procedure. Meghan Markle was, from the outset, a variable of a different order of magnitude entirely. She was American, at a time when the monarchy had never had an American-born working royal in its modern history. She was a divorce, in an institution whose relationship with divorce remained fraught even decades after the upheavals of Charles and Diana's own marriage. She was biracial, the daughter of a black mother, Doria Ragland, and a white father, Thomas Markle Sr., in an institution whose modern history with race had been, at best, uneven, and whose most senior members had, within living memory, made public remarks about race and ethnicity that would not have survived contact with a modern newsroom's editorial standards. She had, unlike any previous partner of a senior royal, a public career built specifically around visibility, 7 seasons as a series regular on the television drama Suits, a role that had made her recognizable to millions of viewers worldwide well before she ever met Harry. And she had, by extension of that career, a public archive unlike anything the institution had previously had to account for. Interviews given to entertainment press over the better part of a decade. A personal Twitter account with opinions on subjects ranging from feminism to political candidates, and a lifestyle blog called The Tig, launched in 2014, where she wrote in her own voice. Under her own byline, with no institutional oversight whatsoever, about everything from travel and food to feminism, self-worth, and her own mixed-race identity. Where previous partners had presented a containment challenge rooted primarily in tabloid interest, reporters chasing them, photographers camping outside their homes, Meghan presented something the institution's risk apparatus had never quite had to model before. A partner who already had a public voice of her own, cultivated deliberately and successfully over a decade in an industry built entirely around visibility and self-presentation. She was not simply someone the press might expose. She was someone who had already, for years, been actively constructing a public identity that the institution had no hand in shaping and no established mechanism for controlling. The relationship was kept private for 5 months, an eternity by the standards of a prince whose past girlfriends had rarely lasted 5 months of press silence before exposure, let alone 5 months of private courtship before the tabloids caught wind. That containment, sources close to the household would later indicate, wasn't accidental, and it wasn't simply the natural product of 2 careful private people trying to protect something new. It was, according to people who worked in royal communications during that period, the product of a deliberate early decision. Whatever was happening between Harry and Meghan would not become public knowledge until the institution had time to assess it, to understand exactly what kind of risk profile this relationship represented before a single tabloid headline forced its hand. The assessment began before the world knew there was anything to assess. Before we go further, where in the world are you watching this from tonight? Drop your country in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story is travelling. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We're building a home for people who want the real history behind the royal family, not just the headlines. Now, back to the story. The private phase ended on October 30th, 2016, when the Sunday Express broke the story publicly for the first time. A brief item confirming that Prince Harry was dating an American actress. Information that had, according to later reporting, been circulating among certain tabloid desks for weeks before any outlet chose to run with it. Within days, the confirmation triggered a cascade. Other outlets scrambled to match the story, digging through Meghan's public record for any usable detail, dispatching photographers to Toronto, where she was based while filming Suits, and to her mother's neighborhood in Los Angeles. What followed was not simply an escalation in tabloid interest of the kind any new royal relationship might expect. It was an escalation the palace itself would later characterize through an unprecedented public statement from Kensington Palace on November 8, 2016, as bordering on the criminal in its intensity, a characterization that, for an institution built around understatement and careful diplomatic language, represented an extraordinary departure from form. The statement, issued directly in Harry's name and drafted with his personal involvement according to people close to the process, did not read like typical royal communications. It read like a plea. It described, in granular and specific terms, exactly what Meghan had been subjected to in the 10 days since the story broke. A wave of abuse and harassment, including racist undertones in press coverage and outright sexism and racism directed at her across social media platforms and website comment sections. It detailed nighttime harassment of her at her home, reporters and photographers besieging her mother's house in Los Angeles to the point where police had to be called, and, perhaps most extraordinary of all, friends and family members being directly approached by journalists offering money in exchange for private information and photographs. For an institution whose entire modern communications philosophy had been built around the principle of never complain, never explain, a doctrine dating back generations, premised on the idea that royal dignity depended on rising above tabloid noise rather than engaging with it directly, the November 8th statement was nothing short of radical. It named specific behaviours. It used the words racist and sexist in an official royal communication, language that had essentially no precedent in the modern history of Buckingham Palace or Kensington Palace press releases. And it positioned Harry, explicitly and publicly, as a man willing to break institutional protocol to protect a woman he had been dating, at that point for less than 6 months. The statement was, in one very real sense, exactly what it appeared to be, a genuine, personal attempt by a grieving son who had watched his own mother destroyed by press intrusion to prevent the same fate from befalling someone he was falling in love with. Multiple people close to Harry at the time would later confirm that the statement's language and the decision to issue it at all came directly from him, not from a communications strategist calculating a public relations play, but from a man acting on the rawest possible version of inherited trauma. The internal drafting process for that statement, according to accounts pieced together years later, reportedly involved genuine disagreement among senior communications staff. Some argued for a considerably softer, more measured version, worried that publicly using words like racist and sexist in an official royal statement would draw the institution itself into a culture war controversy it had always, as a matter of core operating principle, avoided. Others, apparently including Harry himself, pushed back forcefully, arguing that anything less than direct, specific language would fail to adequately convey the severity of what Meghan was actually experiencing. The final version that was released represented, by most accounts, a genuine compromise, more forceful than many courtiers wanted, but still considerably more restrained than an early draft that Harry had reportedly wanted to release, which apparently named specific journalists and publications directly. But inside the palace apparatus itself, the statement was also something else entirely. The first significant data point in an internal debate that would define the next 3 years. How much protection the institution was willing to extend, publicly and resource-intensively, to a partner it had not yet formally vetted, whose long-term place within the family had not yet been decided, and whose risk profile remained, as far as the institution's communications and security apparatus were concerned, still very much an open question. Because the vetting had already begun. And what the vetting was assessing was not, primarily, whether Meghan Markle was a good person, a kind person, or a person genuinely capable of making Harry happy. Those questions, while doubtless present in the minds of individual family members, were secondary to the institution's central and overriding concern. What the vetting was assessing, first and foremost, was whether she was containable. To understand how extraordinary, and yet, in another sense, how utterly unsurprising this vetting process was, it helps to look at how the institution has handled comparable situations across the 20th century. When Prince Andrew's engagement to Sarah Ferguson was being considered in the mid-1980s, palace vetting focused heavily on her family's financial history and her father's business dealings. Concerns that would later prove prescient when Ferguson's own financial troubles became a recurring source of tabloid embarrassment throughout her marriage and beyond. When Prince Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles resurfaced publicly in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Following his divorce from Diana, palace strategists spent years, not months, years, carefully managing public perception before any formal remarriage was permitted to proceed, running what one royal biographer later described as a deliberate, multi-year rehabilitation campaign designed to shift public opinion gradually enough that a wedding, when it finally happened in 2005, would not trigger the kind of backlash Camilla's role in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage might otherwise have produced. Even Kate Middleton, whose relationship with William proceeded with none of the racial or nationality complications that would later surround Meghan, was subjected to a vetting and preparation process that stretched across nearly a decade of dating before marriage. The Camilla precedent deserves particular attention because it represents perhaps the closest historical analogue to what would later happen with Meghan, albeit for entirely different underlying reasons. Camilla's rehabilitation campaign, which this very channel has covered in detail in a separate documentary, involved a deliberate, multi-year strategy of carefully staged public appearances alongside Charles, beginning with a 50th birthday party in 1999, specifically choreographed to generate a single, controlled photograph of the two of them leaving the event together, the first officially sanctioned public acknowledgement of their relationship after decades of it existing largely as an open secret. That photograph and the years of incremental public reintroduction that followed it were the product of an almost identical institutional calculation to the one applied to Meghan nearly 2 decades later. An assessment of public tolerance, a carefully sequenced release of information, and a controlled, deliberate pace designed to manage backlash before it could fully form. The crucial difference, and the one that makes Meghan's situation so much more combustible in hindsight, is that Camilla's rehabilitation had the luxury of nearly a decade to unfold, while Meghan's introduction to the British public was compressed into a period of months, driven by the practical realities of a relationship that had progressed quickly and a media environment that by 2016 moved at a pace no 90s-era containment strategy had ever needed to account for. What made Meghan's situation different was not that vetting occurred. Vetting, in some form, was standard practice for any serious royal relationship. What made it different was the compressed timeline, the far higher stakes given her existing public profile, and the fact that, unlike Kate's decade-long gradual introduction, Meghan's public unveiling happened in a matter of months rather than years, leaving the institution's vetting and preparation apparatus racing to compress a process that had historically unfolded across nearly 10 years into barely more than one. Every serious romantic partner who enters the British royal family passes through a process that has no formal name in any public document, but which former household staff have described in consistent terms across decades: a quiet, compartmentalized assessment run partly through Royal Protection Command, partly through private secretaries, and partly through the informal social vetting of a small circle of family and courtiers who decide, long before any public announcement, whether a relationship is one the institution can survive. It is not a process with a beginning memo or a formal sign-off sheet. It happens in the margins, in conversations between private secretaries over lunch, in briefing notes appended to unrelated security reports, in the kind of institutional muscle memory that doesn't require anyone to formally authorize it because everyone involved already understands, instinctively, that it needs to happen. For Meghan, that process moved faster and touched more departments than it had for any of Harry's previous partners, not because the institution was more suspicious of her specifically, in some vindictive or deliberately hostile sense, but because the risk profile she represented was unlike anything the modern vetting apparatus had been built to assess. Chelsea Davy and Cressida Bonas had both been British or British adjacent, From backgrounds the institution's social vetting mechanisms understood intuitively. Meghan Markle required an entirely different kind of analysis, cross-referencing an American entertainment industry career against British establishment expectations, assessing a decade of American public commentary on political and social issues against an institution that has historically avoided any hint of political opinion, and doing all of it under compressed time pressure. Because the relationship, once it became public in October 2016, was moving faster towards serious commitment than the institution's usual multi-year assessment timeline typically allowed for. The security briefings came first, and they came in granular, almost forensic detail. Meghan's family history, her parents' 1987 divorce after just 2 years of marriage, her half-siblings from her father's first marriage to Rosalind Lovelace, a public record that included financial difficulties on her father's side of the family and in the years that followed the relationship's exposure. Increasingly erratic public statements from extended family members eager to sell their tenuous connection to the story to any tabloid willing to pay was compiled into the kind of background dossier usually reserved for figures being assessed for genuine security threats, not for a prince's girlfriend. Protection officers needed to understand every possible point of exposure, every family member who might speak to press for a payment, every ex-partner who might be approached with an offer, every old social media post, tweet, or blog entry that might resurface at the worst possible moment and require a rapid response. What the dossier found unsettled some of the old guard immediately, according to accounts from people close to the process who would later speak, mostly anonymously, to royal biographers. Meghan had been divorced once already, from talent agent and producer Trevor Engelson, a marriage that had run from 2011 to 2013 before ending, reportedly, under the strain of Meghan's increasingly demanding acting career and the couple's diverging priorities. She had spent a decade building a public persona through a career that required visibility as its central currency. Magazine profiles in outlets like Self and Esquire, red carpet appearances at premieres and industry events, and, most significantly, from the institution's perspective, a personal blog where she'd shared candid opinions on subjects the royal family had spent the better part of a century training its members never to comment on publicly feminism, gender pay gaps in Hollywood, her own experience of racial identity growing up mixed race in Los Angeles, and, in at least one instance that particularly alarmed communications staff, explicit political commentary during the 2016 United States presidential election, in which Meghan had been openly critical of then-candidate Donald Trump. To the security and communications apparatus reviewing this material, none of it read as a character flaw in the ordinary sense. It is worth pausing here to establish, in more detail than the vetting dossier itself likely bothered to convey, exactly who Meghan Markle was in 2016, before any of this began. She had been born in Los Angeles in 1981, raised primarily by her mother, Doria Ragland, a yoga instructor and social worker, following her parents' divorce when Meghan was 6 years old. She attended Immaculate Heart, a private Catholic girls' school in Los Angeles, before going on to Northwestern University, where she studied theatre and international relations, graduating in 2003. Her early career included minor television roles, briefly working as a calligrapher to supplement her income between acting jobs, before landing the role of Rachel Zane on Suits in 2011. A role that would run for 7 seasons and transform her into a recognizable, moderately famous television actress with a substantial and engaged fan base, particularly among women. Meghan was not, by any honest account, someone with a scandal to hide, but to an institution whose entire operating philosophy depended on public neutrality and controlled, minimal exposure, A decade of on-the-record, searchable, quotable public commentary represented something almost more dangerous than a scandal raw material. Years of statements that could, at any moment, be excavated by a hostile press outlet, stripped of context, and turned into a controversy the institution would have no ability to preempt, because the words were already Meghan's own, already public, already permanently searchable. Among the specific items flagged in Meghan's pre-existing public record, one category concerned the vetting team more than almost any other: her documented political commentary during the 2016 US presidential election cycle, running concurrently with the earliest months of her relationship with Harry. In interviews and social media posts predating the relationship's public exposure, Meghan had described herself as embarrassed by candidate Donald Trump's rhetoric. Given that Trump did in fact win the presidency in November 2016, the very same month the relationship became public, this created an immediate and delicate diplomatic problem. A woman about to become romantically linked to the British royal family had, on record, publicly criticised the incoming President of the United States, Britain's most important international ally. The institution's approach to strict political neutrality is not a minor stylistic preference. It is a load-bearing structural principle of how constitutional monarchy functions in Britain, predicated on the sovereign and the royal family remaining entirely above and outside partisan political debate. A member of the family having a documented history of partisan political commentary represented, to the vetting team, a genuinely novel category of risk that none of the institution's existing protocols had ever been designed to address. The eventual approach, according to accounts pieced together by biographers, was straightforward avoidance. Meghan's past political statements were never directly addressed by official palace communications, and she herself adhered strictly to the institution's political neutrality norms for the remainder of her time as a working royal, a form of compliance that went almost entirely unacknowledged in later criticism of her. Simultaneously, a second and quieter process was underway inside the household itself: staff reassignment. According to former employees who spoke to biographers in the years that followed, often on condition of anonymity, given the strict confidentiality culture that governs royal household employment, at least 2 senior aides within Kensington Palace's communications team were reassigned or had their responsibilities restructured specifically to handle what was internally referred to, without any apparent irony or self-awareness, as the American situation. This wasn't wedding planning. There was, at this stage, no wedding to plan. The engagement itself was still more than a year away. This was crisis readiness in its purest, most anticipatory form, building a small, dedicated team whose sole function was managing potential exposure before that exposure had technically even happened, on the theory that reacting to a crisis in real time was always more damaging than preparing for one in advance. The individuals reassigned to this team reportedly came from backgrounds specifically suited to crisis communications, rather than the more ceremonial, protocol-focused work that dominated most royal press office roles. At least one had previously worked in corporate crisis communications outside the royal household before joining Kensington Palace's staff, bringing an outside industry sensibility to risk management that some long-time royal staff reportedly found jarringly commercial in tone, more suited to managing a corporate scandal than easing a new member into a centuries-old family institution. That tension between an increasingly professionalized, risk-averse communications culture and the more traditional, relationship-based diplomatic approach that had historically governed how the institution handled sensitive matters would itself become a recurring undercurrent throughout the years that followed, as Meghan and Harry increasingly felt they were being managed like a reputational liability rather than embraced as family. The reassigned staff began compiling what one former household source described, years later, as a risk map, a working document tracking every foreseeable point at which Meghan's pre-royal life might collide, publicly and uncontrollably, with her new royal identity. Her acting career was mapped scene by scene for content that might prove embarrassing under a royal spotlight. Her charitable work, which was genuine and had included international development work with the United Nations and World Vision, was assessed for how it might be leveraged positively, but also for whether any of the causes she'd previously supported carried political dimensions that could create friction with the institution's strict neutrality. Even her friendships were mapped, a working list of who in her existing social circle might be approached by press, who might be trusted to stay silent, and who represented a genuine and ongoing risk of unauthorized disclosure. That risk map, according to accounts pieced together by biographers from multiple household sources, extended into territory that would strike most outside observers as extraordinary in its thoroughness. Meghan's circle of close friends from her Suits years in Toronto, a group that included stylist Jessica Mulroney, whose own family carried significant Canadian political and media connections through her father-in-law, former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, was individually assessed for reliability and discretion. Her college friendships from Northwestern were reviewed. Even her yoga instructor mother, Doria Ragland, described consistently by everyone who has ever spoken about her publicly as intensely private and press-averse, was included in the security assessment, with protection officers reportedly developing a specific plan for managing potential press interest in her Los Angeles neighborhood well before any of that interest actually materialized. The thoroughness of this mapping reflects something important about how the institution actually operates that rarely makes it into the sanitized public narrative of royal romance. Nothing is left to chance. Every person in a prospective royal spouse's orbit is treated, at least provisionally, as a potential point of failure, not out of malice toward that individual, but because the institution's entire operating philosophy is built around eliminating uncertainty wherever it can be eliminated, and treating every unmanaged relationship as a variable requiring active oversight. If you're finding this story as unsettling as I do, let me know in the comments what part of this process surprises you most. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, where we get into the closed-door meeting that decided how much of Meghan's life the palace would allow the public to see. Let's continue. The closed-door meeting that would come to define the institution's early posture toward Meghan took place, according to multiple accounts compiled by royal biographers in subsequent years, in the weeks immediately following the November 2016 statement. A meeting attended by senior communications staff, at least one member of Harry's protection team, and, crucially, representatives from the offices of both the Queen and Prince Charles. A level of senior institutional attendance that itself signalled how seriously the relationship was already being taken, more than a year before any engagement announcement. The subject of the meeting was not whether the relationship should continue. By that point, Harry had made clear, through both his actions and the extraordinary November statement, that the relationship was serious, and that he was prepared to defend it publicly against institutional caution if necessary. And the family's instinct, publicly at least, and to a significant degree privately as well, was to support him, particularly given the searing, still fresh institutional memory of how the press had treated his mother 2 decades earlier, and the very real fear among senior royals that a repeat of that dynamic, this time directed at Harry's partner, could produce consequences the family was not prepared to survive again, whether reputationally or, in the darkest reading of that fear, literally, the subject of the meeting instead. was narrower and considerably colder, not whether to support the relationship, but how much of Meghan Markle's life, career and public statements the institution was willing to let the world continue to see once she formally entered the family. It was, in essence, a meeting about editing a person, about deciding which parts of a fully formed, independently successful 35-year-old woman's public identity could be preserved, and which parts needed to be quietly, permanently removed before they became liabilities. The phrase used in that meeting, according to an account later relayed by someone present to a royal biographer researching the period, was not about welcome. It was about exposure. Specifically, the question of whether the TIG, Meghan's lifestyle blog, needed to be shut down before any formal announcement, given its years of accumulated personal opinion on exactly the kinds of subjects, race, feminism, politics, the institution most wanted to avoid being associated with. The discussion extended to whether her past acting work, including scenes from Suits that involved romantic or intimate content, represented a liability that needed active, deliberate management rather than the passive hope that tabloid researchers simply wouldn't bother digging through 7 seasons of a legal drama for embarrassing clips. The decision, ultimately, and by all available accounts unanimously among those present, was containment through erasure rather than engagement. It is worth understanding who, specifically, is believed to have been in that room, insofar as accounts have pieced it together. Royal biographer sources have suggested the meeting included Harry's then private secretary, a senior representative from the Queen's own household communications office, and, in a detail that would only become clear years later through subsequent reporting, a representative sent specifically by Prince Charles's office, an inclusion that some sources have suggested reflected Charles's own particular sensitivity to reputational risk, shaped by his decades of personally difficult experience with tabloid coverage of his own private life. Notably, no one from Meghan's own life, no representative acting on her behalf, no lawyer, no advisor of her choosing, was present. The decisions being made about which parts of her public identity would be permitted to survive her entry into the family were made entirely by people she had, at that point, likely never even met. This detail matters enormously to the story this video is telling, because it captures something the sanitized wedding narrative could never convey: the fundamental asymmetry of power built into the process by which an outsider becomes a royal. Meghan Markle, an accomplished, independent, financially self-sufficient professional woman with a decade of successful career decisions behind her, entered a process in which some of the most consequential decisions about her own public identity, decisions about what she would and would not be permitted to say, publish or represent to the world, were made in a room she was not invited into, by people acting in the institution's interest rather than her own. Rather than allowing Meghan's existing public identity to stand and simply managing press inquiries as they arose, the approach that, arguably, might have preserved more of her authentic voice and avoided the appearance of institutional control that would later become a central grievance in her account of these years, the decision was to systematically dismantle the public footprint she had spent a decade building. The TIG was shuttered in April 2017, 7 full months before the engagement was even publicly announced, with a brief farewell message thanking readers for 3 years of stories about food, travel, and self-discovery, and no explanation whatsoever offered for the sudden closure of what had, by that point, become a moderately successful, independent media property with its own advertising revenue and a loyal readership numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The closure caught the TIG's own small staff, including an editor and several contributing writers who had worked with Meghan for years, almost entirely by surprise, according to accounts one former contributor later gave to a lifestyle publication. There was no winding down period, no final farewell content series, no acknowledgement to loyal readers of why. After 3 years of consistent publication, the site was ending abruptly. The abruptness itself is telling. It suggests a decision made under institutional pressure and executed quickly, rather than a personal choice by Meghan to gradually step back from a project she had built with genuine care and investment. Interviews with people who worked alongside Meghan on the site describe her as personally engaged in nearly every aspect of its editorial direction, from commissioning specific pieces to personally editing drafts, hardly the profile of someone eager to abandon the project voluntarily. Meghan's personal social media accounts, once active, candid, and genuinely reflective of her own voice, went quiet in the months that followed and were eventually deleted entirely. Her Instagram account, with its several million followers, her personal Twitter account, the accumulated digital footprint of a decade in public life, systematically dismantled in the months before the world was even told she was engaged to a prince, let alone before she'd had any opportunity to establish a new, officially sanctioned royal public voice to replace what had been taken away. This was the 7-month machine the public never saw, not a fairy tale accelerating naturally and joyfully toward a wedding, but an institution quietly deciding, department by department, meeting by meeting, how much of the real Meghan Markle it was willing to let survive the transition into royal life, and concluding, well before the engagement photograph was ever taken, that the answer, for an institution built around minimizing risk above almost every other consideration, was as little as possible. The scale of public interest that greeted the November 27th announcement is worth pausing on, because it helps explain why the institution's containment strategy, however carefully constructed, was always going to face pressure that no previous royal engagement had generated in quite the same way. Within hours of the announcement, it was the single most searched news topic globally on multiple platforms simultaneously. American media outlets, which had historically covered the British royal family as a niche interest story, suddenly treated the engagement as front page, top of broadcast news, a reflection of Meghan's existing American celebrity built over 7 seasons of Suits, colliding with the institution's own considerable global reach in a way that produced an entirely new order of magnitude of press interest. Commentators at the time, largely without access to the internal vetting process that had already been underway for a year, framed the engagement almost universally through a lens of celebratory modernization. Newspaper editorials in the United States and Britain alike described the match as evidence that the monarchy was evolving to reflect a more diverse, more contemporary understanding of Britishness. Commentators of colour, in particular, wrote extensively and often movingly about what it meant to see a mixed-race woman formally welcomed into one of the world's most visible and historically homogeneous institutions. Pieces that, in hindsight, carry a particular poignancy given what would unfold over the following 3 years. Publications aimed specifically at black and mixed-race readerships in both the United States and Britain ran feature-length pieces exploring what Meghan's arrival might mean for representation within an institution that had, throughout its modern history, remained almost entirely white in its senior working membership. Some commentators drew explicit comparisons to other historic moments of institutional integration, while others struck a more cautious note, questioning whether the monarchy's evident enthusiasm for the optics of diversity would translate into any genuine structural change in how the institution operated, or whether Meghan would ultimately be expected to simply conform to existing norms while providing a convenient visual symbol of modernization. That cautious, more skeptical strand of commentary, largely drowned out in the initial wave of celebratory coverage, would prove, within a few short years, to have anticipated the eventual outcome with uncomfortable accuracy. By the time Kensington Palace confirmed the engagement on November 27, 2017, the machine had already done its work. What the public received that morning was not, in any meaningful sense, an introduction to the real Meghan Markle. It was a finished product, a version of her that had been sanded down, vetted, restructured, and formally approved by a communications apparatus that had spent the better part of a year deciding exactly how much of her story the world would be permitted to hear, and in exactly what order, and framed by exactly whose voice. The engagement itself had been carefully staged, even in its most seemingly spontaneous details. The announcement came through Clarence House, on behalf of the Prince of Wales, in language that followed the exact formal template used for royal engagement announcements for generations, a linguistic continuity that, whether intentional or not, worked to fold Meghan's arrival into the institution's established rhythms rather than presenting her introduction as anything genuinely new. The photographs released that afternoon, taken in the Sunken Garden at Kensington Palace, a location with deliberate symbolic resonance as a garden closely associated with Diana, showed a couple radiating comfort and ease. Meghan in a belted white coat, Harry's arm around her waist, both of them laughing in a manner that read, to millions of viewers, as entirely natural and unrehearsed. The engagement interview itself, filmed later that same day and broadcast that evening on the BBC, was a considerably more managed production than its relaxed, conversational tone suggested. Every question had been agreed in advance with the broadcaster, a standard practice for royal interviews, but one that took on additional significance given everything that had preceded it. Every answer, according to sources close to the process who spoke to biographers in subsequent years, had been rehearsed extensively beforehand, not scripted word for word in the manner of a political press conference, but shaped and workshopped over multiple sessions with communications staff who understood, with professional precision. Exactly which phrases would play warmly to a global audience and which might open new and unwelcome lines of scrutiny. Meghan spoke, in that interview, about the moment Harry proposed, a quiet evening at Nottingham Cottage, their shared London residence at the time, with Harry attempting to cook a roast chicken, just an amazing surprise. It was so sweet and natural, she said. The ring on her finger made from 3 diamonds, the smaller 2 sourced from the personal collection of Princess Diana herself, a detail clearly intended and clearly received by the public as a symbolic passing of a kind of maternal blessing across a 20-year gap. It was warm. It was disarming. It was, by careful design, almost entirely free of anything that might invite the press back into the parts of her life the palace had spent 7 months quietly, systematically closing off. The physical details of the interview itself are worth dwelling on, because they illustrate just how comprehensively managed the presentation was. Meghan wore a white-belted coat by Canadian designer Line the Label, a choice that was, according to fashion commentators who analysed the outfit in exhaustive detail in the days that followed, almost certainly not accidental, a nod to her years living and working in Canada that also, conveniently, avoided any of the more overtly American or Hollywood-coded fashion choices that might have read, to a British audience already primed by tabloid coverage to view her through a lens of American excess as somehow inappropriate for the occasion. The Sunken Garden location itself, chosen deliberately for its associations with Diana, who had used the same garden for other significant royal photographs during her lifetime, worked to visually and symbolically connect Meghan to the one figure in recent royal history whose memory the public still held with something approaching unconditional affection and sympathy. Even the seating arrangement during the filmed interview segment was considered, the 2 of them positioned closely together on a bench, Harry's hand resting protectively near Meghan's. a physical staging designed to communicate intimacy and partnership without appearing choreographed. Every element, from wardrobe to location to physical positioning, had been the subject of advanced discussion among the small team managing the announcement, precisely because the institution understood that this single, carefully constructed hour of television would do more to establish the public's initial impression of Meghan than anything that followed for months afterward. What the interview did not include, and what its careful construction ensured could not organically arise, was any meaningful discussion of her first marriage to Trevor Engelson, her strained and increasingly public relationship with her father Thomas Markle. A relationship that would later explode into open public view in ways the palace's own vetting process had clearly anticipated as a risk and had clearly hoped, through careful management, to delay for as long as possible, or her decade of on-record public statements about race, feminism, and American politics that had made her, prior to meeting Harry, one of the more openly opinionated public figures ever to enter the British royal family by marriage. The press, for a period of months that would later come to feel almost like a different era entirely given what followed, largely cooperated with the frame it had been given. Coverage in the weeks immediately following the engagement leaned overwhelmingly celebratory, described consistently as a modernizing moment for the monarchy, proof that the institution could evolve and adapt to reflect a more diverse, more contemporary Britain. A mixed-race American actress and divorce entering a family that had, within living memory, been unable to countenance a reigning king marrying a divorced woman. A reference to the abdication crisis of 1936 that royal commentators invoked repeatedly and approvingly throughout this period. The optics were, briefly and genuinely, exactly what the palace's original communication strategy had been engineered from the outset to produce: acceptance, celebration, and a sense of institutional renewal. Quick question for you before we continue. Do you think the palace's decision to manage Meghan's public image so tightly from the beginning set the relationship up to fail, or was it simply standard practice they'd have done for any new royal spouse? Tell me what you think in the comments. If you're enjoying this deep dive, make sure you're subscribed. There's a lot more of this story to go. Back to it. But containment strategies built to manage a single news cycle, however carefully engineered, are rarely built to survive the sustained, months-long scrutiny that precedes a globally televised royal wedding. And by the early months of 2018, the seams the palace had worked so hard for 7 months to hide began, inevitably, to show. Thomas Markle, Meghan's father, became the first major failure point in the containment plan, precisely the failure point that sources close to the original vetting process had flagged as a significant risk more than a year earlier, when the security dossier compiled on Meghan's family had specifically noted his financial difficulties and his physical and relational distance from her as points of exposure the institution had essentially no ability to control. Estranged from his daughter in the years immediately preceding the engagement, financially strained after decades working as a lighting director in the television industry, and living a quiet, relatively isolated life across the border in Rosarito, Mexico, Thomas Markle became an obvious and irresistible target for tabloid outlets willing to pay substantial sums for access to the one member of Meghan's inner circle. The palace's extensive containment machinery had no legal or practical ability to reach, silence, or manage. In May 2018, in the days immediately before the wedding, it emerged through investigative reporting that Thomas Markle had cooperated with a paparazzi agency to stage a series of photographs of himself in exchange for payment reported to be in the tens of thousands of dollars, images specifically designed to appear candid and unposed, showing him reading up on English history and the royal family in an internet cafe, being fitted for a wedding suit and working out at a gym, ostensibly to get in shape for the ceremony. The staged, transparently manufactured nature of the photographs was quickly and thoroughly exposed by other outlets, triggering a cascading wave of public embarrassment that Thomas Markle attempted to manage through a series of increasingly erratic and contradictory public statements. Those subsequent statements are worth cataloguing briefly because they illustrate exactly the kind of unmanageable, real-time public relations crisis the palace's containment apparatus had been specifically designed to prevent. In the days following the staged photo revelation, Thomas Markle gave a lengthy interview to a British tabloid in which he criticised the royal family directly, suggested Meghan and Harry should have called him personally to check on his well-being rather than communicating through intermediaries, and revealed private details about conversations he claimed to have had with Meghan about the wedding planning process. He would go on, in the years that followed, to give dozens of further interviews, often contradicting his own previous statements. At one point, suggesting reconciliation with his daughter was imminent, and in other interviews given only weeks later, describing the estrangement as total and possibly permanent. Each new interview generated its own fresh cycle of tabloid coverage, each one a fresh reminder to the global public of exactly the kind of unmanaged family chaos the original vetting process had specifically flagged as a risk, and specifically failed to neutralize. The result was an image that would have been genuinely unthinkable to the communications team that had spent 7 exhaustive months trying to ensure exactly this kind of unmanaged, uncontrolled public chaos never reached the ceremony itself. Days before the wedding, Thomas Markle announced he would not attend at all, citing a heart procedure he had reportedly just undergone. Leaving Meghan without a father to walk her down the aisle, Meghan Markle walking partway down the aisle of St. George's Chapel entirely alone, before being met partway by Prince Charles, who stepped in to walk her the remainder of the distance, a moment of genuine grace and warmth between Meghan and her future father-in-law. But one born entirely out of a crisis the palace's elaborate containment strategy had utterly failed to prevent. The wedding itself, on May 19, 2018, nonetheless proceeded largely as planned in front of a global television audience estimated in the hundreds of millions, a ceremony blending traditional Anglican liturgy with deliberate elements drawn from Meghan's own African-American cultural background, including a fiery, unconventional sermon on the power of love from Bishop Michael Curry, the first African-American presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, and a performance by the Kingdom Choir, a British gospel ensemble, that together signalled publicly and unmistakably exactly the modernizing note the palace's original strategy had always intended the marriage to strike. It was, by every visible external measure, a triumph, one of the most watched and warmly received royal events in a generation. Bishop Curry's sermon deserves particular attention because it represented, in a single televised address watched by hundreds of millions of people, the most direct and unfiltered expression of Meghan's own cultural background that the entire carefully managed wedding day contained, delivered in the passionate, rhythmic cadence characteristic of the African-American preaching tradition, drawing explicitly on the words of Martin Luther King Jr., and centering the transformative, redemptive power of love as a force capable of changing the world. The address stood in striking, almost jarring contrast to the restrained, traditionally British liturgical style that had characterized every previous royal wedding held in that same chapel. Reaction to the sermon split sharply along lines that, in retrospect, previewed the broader divide in how Meghan herself would come to be received. Many viewers, particularly younger audiences and audiences in the United States, praised the sermon as a genuinely moving, authentic moment that meaningfully represented Meghan's heritage within an institution not otherwise known for cultural inclusivity. Others, including a notable strand of British tabloid commentary in the days immediately following the wedding, criticised the sermon's length and its perceived departure from appropriate royal decorum, criticism that, again, in retrospect, reads as an early instance of exactly the pattern of scrutiny that would come to define coverage of Meghan more broadly, her authentic self-expression treated, by a meaningful portion of the press, as a transgression against institutional norms rather than a welcome expansion of them. The ceremony itself lasted just under an hour, held at St. George's Chapel on the grounds of Windsor Castle rather than the more traditionally favoured Westminster Abbey, a venue choice that reportedly reflected a preference for a more intimate setting given the 600 guests in attendance, a modest number by the standards of previous royal weddings. 600 additional members of the public, selected from nominations for community service, were invited to watch the arrivals from the castle grounds, another deliberate touch intended to signal the modernising, more inclusive spirit the palace's strategy had been built around from the very beginning. Elton John performed during the reception. The evening reception, held separately at Frogmore House, featured a speech from Prince Charles and, according to guests who later spoke about the evening, a genuinely warm, celebratory atmosphere that stood in stark contrast to the institutional tension that had characterized so much of the preceding 18 months. But the containment machine that had made the wedding day itself possible, the vetting, the systematic erasure of Meghan's independent public voice, the 7 months of intensely managed exposure, had not disappeared simply because the ceremony had concluded successfully. If anything, in the months that followed, it tightened its grip further, because a working royal with an active, established public role was, from the perspective of palace communications, a considerably more complicated and unpredictable variable to manage than an engaged partner whose public appearances could still be tightly scripted and limited in number had ever been. That tension between an institution built, structurally and historically, around containment as its primary defense mechanism, and a woman who had spent her entire adult life deliberately building an independent public voice, would not stay buried much longer. To understand the texture of the press environment Meghan was navigating during this period, it helps to look at specific, documented examples rather than general characterizations. In one widely cited instance, a British tabloid ran a story criticizing Meghan for eating avocado toast, framing the food choice as evidence of privileged obliviousness given avocado farming's documented links to drought and, in some growing regions, organized crime involvement in Latin America, a criticism that had rarely, if ever, been leveled at any other public figure photographed eating the same increasingly ubiquitous dish. In another, coverage of Meghan touching her own pregnant stomach during a public engagement was framed critically, using language suggesting the gesture was performative, in notable contrast to near-identical, repeatedly photographed gestures by Kate during her own 3 pregnancies, which had generally been described in warm, protective, entirely uncritical terms. Royal commentators and media analysts, reviewing this pattern in the years that followed, would point to dozens of similar paired examples, actions taken by both women that received strikingly different editorial framing, often within the same publication and sometimes within the same week. The cumulative effect, whatever any individual editor's intent in any single instance, was a body of coverage that treated Meghan's presence within the institution as inherently more scrutinized, more suspect, and more newsworthy as controversy than equivalent behavior from her sister-in-law. Meghan's first year as a full working member of the royal family unfolded, from the outside, as a genuine and largely successful demonstration of exactly the modernization the palace's original strategy had hoped, from the very beginning, to sell to a global public. She threw herself into her assigned patronages with a visible energy and personal engagement that stood out sharply against the more measured, decades-honed, deliberately understated public style of her sister-in-law, Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge. She wrote, under her own name, the foreword for a charity cookbook produced by a group of women affected by the Grenfell Tower fire, a 2017 tragedy that had killed 72 people in a public housing block in West London, a cause she had reportedly sought out and championed personally, visiting the community kitchen repeatedly and privately, without press cameras present in the months before the book's publication. She launched a clothing capsule collection in partnership with SmartWorks, a charity helping unemployed and disadvantaged women prepare professionally for job interviews, donating pieces and personally attending fittings. She and Harry undertook a 15-day royal tour of Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, and Tonga in the autumn of 2018, Meghan's first major overseas tour as a royal, undertaken while newly, though not yet publicly, pregnant, that drew crowds in numbers comparable to those historically reserved for only the most popular and established royals of a generation. Beyond the SmartWorks and Grenfell work, Meghan formally took on 4 patronages of her own in January 2019. The National Theatre, the Association of Commonwealth Universities, the animal welfare charity Mayhew, and, significantly, the Royal Foundation alongside Harry, William, and Kate. Her engagement with these causes was, by the accounts of people who worked directly with her at each organisation, genuinely hands-on rather than merely ceremonial. She reportedly spent hours in private, unpublicised visits to Mayhew's animal shelter facilities and pushed for the National Theatre to expand outreach programmes specifically targeting underrepresented communities in London. This granular, detail-oriented engagement with her patronages stood in some tension with the media narrative developing in parallel throughout 2019 that painted her as image-conscious and superficial, a narrative gap that would itself become a source of private frustration for Meghan, according to people close to her at the time. But inside the institution itself, the containment apparatus that had so carefully shaped her introduction to the public throughout 2017 did not relax simply because the wedding had happened and the initial public reception had proven overwhelmingly positive. If anything, according to multiple accounts that would emerge from household staff in the years that followed, it tightened its focus considerably because a working royal with an active, visible and independently sourced public voice was, from the perspective of palace communication strategists, a substantially more complicated and harder to predict variable than an engaged partner whose every public appearance could still be scripted, limited in frequency, and closely managed had ever represented. Every cause Meghan chose independently to support, every op-ed she was rumoured, sometimes accurately and sometimes not, to have privately advised or contributed language to, every small physical gesture, the now infamous instance of her folding her hands protectively over her visibly pregnant belly during a public appearance, a gesture some newspaper columnists absurdly and pointedly characterized in print as a deliberate, attention-seeking display rather than an ordinary and unremarkable action any pregnant woman might make, became fodder for a press ecosystem that seemed, within roughly 18 months of the wedding, to have reversed entirely and dramatically from its earlier, overwhelmingly celebratory tone. The difference in tone between press coverage of Meghan and press coverage of Kate Middleton became, during this period, a recurring and increasingly well-documented point of both internal institutional tension and open public debate. Direct, side-by-side comparisons of near-identical actions covered in, strikingly, sometimes almost comically different language became a talking point that Meghan and Harry themselves would later reference directly and specifically in subsequent interviews and public statements. Where Kate's pregnancy-related habits and choices were consistently framed by tabloid coverage as glowing, natural and relatable, Meghan's nearly identical choices during her own pregnancy were, in a considerable body of coverage, framed instead as demanding, high maintenance, or evidence of diva-like behaviour. Where Kate's fashion choices were reliably described as elegant, tasteful and appropriately restrained, Meghan's comparable choices were, with notable frequency, framed instead as extravagant, inappropriate, or a sign of American excess clashing with British sensibility. The pattern extended into coverage of Meghan's pregnancy with Archie, announced in October 2018 during the very same royal tour of Australia that was meant to showcase her successful integration into royal life. Commentary around her maternity wardrobe choices, in particular a tendency to wear more fitted, form-following clothing rather than the looser, more traditionally modest maternity styles favoured by previous pregnant royals, generated a disproportionate volume of critical coverage, much of it framed around the idea that she was somehow drawing inappropriate attention to her pregnant body. Criticism that stood in notable contrast to the near-uniformly positive coverage Kate had received for stylistically similar choices during her own 3 pregnancies in preceding years. Even Meghan's decision to keep the specific details of Archie's birth relatively private, declining the traditional practice of posing for official photographs on the hospital steps within hours of delivery, opting instead for a private birth followed by a photo call several days later, was covered by significant portions of the British press as a break with tradition bordering on rejection of royal duty rather than as the entirely reasonable personal choice of a new mother that it plainly was. Inside the household, according to accounts that emerged in subsequent years from multiple former staff members, tension was building on a second front as well, running parallel to the press coverage disparity. A strained and increasingly formalised separation between the communications and household staff supporting Harry and Meghan and the wider, more established machinery serving William and Kate, exacerbated by the physical reality that the two couples, once housed together administratively under a single joint office structure that had functioned reasonably smoothly during Harry's bachelor years and the early period of his relationship with Meghan, were formally moved into entirely separate operational structures in 2019. This formal institutional split, announced through both offices in carefully neutral language, was publicly characterized by Palace Communications as a natural evolution, reflecting the growing size and complexity of both households, an explanation that was not, on its face, unreasonable, given that both couples now had genuinely distinct workloads, staff needs, and public profiles. But insiders who spoke to biographers in subsequent years described the split in considerably more strained terms, characterizing it less as an amicable administrative restructuring and more as the formal, bureaucratic expression of a personal and professional rift between the two couples and their respective staffs that had been building, largely out of public view, for the better part of a year. Reports that would later surface, disputed in their specifics by representatives for both couples but broadly consistent in their overall shape across multiple independent sources, described friction rooted partly in genuinely different working styles. Meghan, accustomed to the fast-paced production culture of American television, reportedly found the more measured, deliberate pace of traditional royal household operations frustrating, while some long-time household staff reportedly found her direct communication style was, at points, difficult to adjust to after years of working within an institutional culture that prized indirection and diplomatic circumlocution above almost all else. Separately, and more consequentially, reports emerged of specific interpersonal friction between Meghan and Kate during the wedding planning process in early 2018, involving a disagreement over bridesmaid dress fittings for Princess Charlotte that reportedly left Kate in tears. an account Meghan would later, in the 2021 Oprah interview, directly reverse, stating that it was in fact she who had been reduced to tears by the exchange, and that Kate had since apologized. The competing accounts, whichever version proves closer to the truth, illustrate precisely the kind of granular interpersonal strain that the institution's containment apparatus, built to manage external press threats, had essentially no tools to address when the friction was occurring internally between family members behind closed doors. The formal office split of 2019 was accompanied, according to later reporting, by a broader reorganization of household staff loyalties and reporting lines that some observers within the institution described as effectively creating two competing power centers within what had previously been a unified communications operation. William and Kate's operation, headquartered at Kensington Palace alongside a growing staff, and Harry and Meghan's smaller, increasingly under-resourced operation, which several former staff members would later describe as chronically understaffed relative to the volume of both positive and negative press attention it was required to manage. This resourcing imbalance, whether intentional or simply a byproduct of institutional inertia favouring the more senior, direct line to the throne couple, left Harry and Meghan's team with proportionally fewer tools to combat the increasingly hostile press narrative building around them throughout 2019. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know we don't do speculation without sourcing, so let me know in the comments. Did you notice the shift in press tone during this period as it was happening in real time, or does it only look obvious in hindsight? Make sure you're subscribed, because the next chapter covers the moment this tension became public and irreversible. Let's keep going. To understand why the press turn against Meghan was so swift and so total, it helps to understand the specific economic and structural pressures facing the British tabloid industry during exactly this period. Print circulation across virtually every major British tabloid had been in a state of sustained, accelerating decline throughout the 2010s, driven by the broader global shift toward digital news consumption and the corresponding collapse of traditional print advertising revenue. Royal coverage had, for decades, functioned as one of the most reliable circulation drivers available to these publications. Meghan's arrival represented, from a purely commercial standpoint, an extraordinary opportunity for an industry desperately searching for content that could reverse, or at least slow, its structural decline. Her existing American celebrity meant stories about her travelled internationally in a way that stories about previous royal in-laws rarely had, generating syndication revenue that added meaningfully to the bottom line of outlets willing to invest heavily in covering her. But the same dynamic that made positive coverage of Meghan commercially valuable also made critical controversy generating coverage of her even more valuable. Outrage and controversy across virtually every media platform in the digital era reliably generates higher engagement than straightforward positive coverage, translating directly into higher click-through rates and ultimately greater advertising revenue. Several media analysts who studied the coverage patterns in detail during this period have pointed to this underlying commercial incentive structure as a significant, if rarely acknowledged, contributing factor to the tonal shift documented earlier in this chapter. A former tabloid editor, speaking anonymously to a media trade publication years later, described the calculation bluntly. Stories framing Meghan negatively simply performed better across every meaningful commercial metric than stories framing her positively. And in an industry under existential financial pressure, that commercial reality inevitably shaped editorial decisions, whatever individual journalists' personal views might have been. This economic context does not excuse the specific instances of coverage that crossed, by almost any reasonable standard, from legitimate scrutiny into something closer to harassment. But it does help explain why the containment strategy built so carefully in 2017 was, in a sense, fighting against structural economic forces far larger than any single palace communications team could realistically hope to manage. The turning point, the specific moment at which the private strain between Meghan and the British press, and by extension the institution that had spent years attempting to manage that press relationship on her behalf, became an open, undeniable, and ultimately irreversible public rupture, arrived in October 2019, when it was revealed that Meghan was pursuing legal action against the Mail on Sunday over its publication, earlier that year, of a private, handwritten letter she had sent to her estranged father, Thomas Markle, following his non-attendance at the wedding. The lawsuit was extraordinary by the standards of royal precedent, and its extraordinariness was, in itself, a form of institutional statement. Royal family members did not, as a matter of long-established practice, sue the press, not primarily because they lacked legitimate legal grounds to do so on any number of occasions over the decades, but because litigation of this kind inevitably invited exactly the sort of prolonged, forensic, discovery-driven media scrutiny that the institution's entire modern communications philosophy, refined over generations, was specifically built to avoid at almost any cost. A lawsuit meant depositions. It meant court filings entering the public record. It meant journalists combing through legal documents for embarrassing details that would otherwise never have surfaced. Meghan's decision to proceed with legal action anyway, reportedly against the explicit private counsel of at least some senior palace communications advisers, represented, for the first time since the original vetting process had begun nearly 3 years earlier, a clear and unambiguous instance of her acting directly against the containment instinct the institution had, from the very outset of the relationship, attempted to instill as the default operating principle governing every decision of consequence. The same month, in a television documentary titled Harry and Meghan, An African Journey, filmed during the couple's official tour of southern Africa that autumn, Harry gave an interview to ITV journalist Tom Bradby that would prove every bit as consequential as Meghan's lawsuit, and in some ways considerably more so given his position within the institution itself. Speaking with visible emotional strain about the cumulative pressure of the preceding months, Harry acknowledged publicly, for the first time on the record, the widely rumoured tension with his brother William, stating that they were now on different paths, a direct, unambiguous confirmation of a rift the palace's communications apparatus had spent months trying to characterise, whenever journalists raised the subject, as nothing more than ordinary sibling dynamics receiving disproportionate media attention. Meghan, interviewed separately in the same documentary, was asked by Bradby a simple, direct question: whether she was okay. Her answer, delivered with a rawness and visible emotional vulnerability that stunned observers accustomed to the carefully modulated, relentlessly composed public presence the palace's original containment strategy had spent 3 years cultivating around her, consisted of a single, devastating sentence. "Not many people have asked if I'm okay." That sentence, 6 words, delivered without visible rehearsal, without the careful workshopping that had characterized every prior significant public statement she had made since the 2017 engagement interview, did more to puncture the machine's original containment plan than anything the press itself, for all its aggressive and often unfair coverage, had managed to publish in 3 years. The Mail on Sunday lawsuit, while the most publicly prominent, was not the only legal front Meghan and Harry pursued during this period. Harry separately brought legal action against several tabloid publishers over alleged phone hacking practices dating back years, joining a broader wave of celebrity litigation targeting the same publishers implicated in the 2011 phone hacking scandal that had already brought down the news of the world. He also pursued legal action over invasive paparazzi photography, including a case concerning helicopter surveillance of the property where he and Meghan were staying during the early months of Archie's life, and a separate case regarding photographs taken of the couple during a private visit to Botswana. Collectively, these legal actions represented something the palace's original containment strategy had never anticipated needing to account for: a member of the family and his soon-to-be wife, actively and aggressively using the court system as a tool against the very press ecosystem the institution's own communication strategy depended on maintaining a working, if uneasy, relationship with. Every lawsuit filed generated its own cycle of headlines, its own discovery process, its own opportunities for embarrassing detail to surface, precisely the kind of self-perpetuating media cycle the institution's never complain, never explain doctrine had been specifically designed over generations to avoid triggering. It was Meghan herself, unscripted and entirely unmanaged in that specific documentary moment, telling the global public directly and unambiguously that the carefully constructed version of her life they had been shown since November 2017 was not, in fact, the full story. Within 3 months, the elaborate arrangement the palace had spent 3 years painstakingly building, Meghan as a contained, managed, carefully controlled institutional variable, would collapse entirely. What the public statement on January 8, 2020 did not reveal was the months of increasingly strained private negotiation that had preceded it. According to accounts later compiled by multiple biographers with access to household sources, Harry had raised the possibility of a reduced, more independent royal role with senior family members as early as mid-2019. Following the birth of Archie and the couple's African tour, conversations that reportedly went nowhere met largely with polite deflection rather than any substantive engagement with the underlying concerns Harry and Meghan were raising about mental health support, press protection, and financial independence. The frustration born of those unproductive private conversations, compounded by the couple's belief that the institution's communications apparatus was, at points, actively working against their interests rather than protecting them, appears to have been the direct catalyst for the decision to bypass formal channels entirely and announce their intentions publicly. It was, in its own way, a mirror of the very containment logic the institution had applied to Meghan from the beginning, except now inverted, with Harry and Meghan seizing control of the narrative and the timeline in a way the institution had never permitted them to do. On January 8, 2020, Harry and Meghan published a statement directly on their own official Instagram account, @SussexRoyal, announcing their intention to step back as senior members of the royal family and work toward becoming financially independent. A statement released, notably and almost unbelievably by the standards of institutional protocol, without prior sign-off or even advance warning to the Queen's private office. An almost unthinkable breach of the chain of communication that confirmed, publicly and unambiguously, exactly what the institution had spent 3 years working to prevent: a working member of the family acting entirely outside the containment structure that had governed every prior decision of consequence in the relationship since its earliest private days. The statement's language was itself carefully crafted by Harry and Meghan's own independent communications team, a team assembled specifically because the couple had, by this point, concluded they could no longer rely on the palace's own communications apparatus to represent their interests. It announced a desire to carve out a progressive new role within the institution, to become financially independent, and to split their time between the United Kingdom and North America, a vision of semi-detached royal life that had, reportedly, been the subject of private discussions between Harry and senior royal family members for months beforehand. Discussions that had, according to multiple accounts, produced no meaningful resolution or agreement, leading Harry and Meghan to conclude that the only way to force genuine change was to announce their intentions publicly and unilaterally. The statement triggered what multiple palace insiders would later describe, in interviews conducted for subsequent biographical accounts, as genuine and immediate institutional panic. Buckingham Palace's official response, issued the same day, was uncharacteristically blunt and visibly hurried by the standards of an institution whose statements typically underwent extensive drafting and review, acknowledging simply that discussions with the couple were at an early stage and that the complexity of the issues involved meant it would take time to work through them. Crisis talks were convened within days of the announcement, culminating in a face-to-face summit at Sandringham House on January 13th, attended personally by the Queen, Prince Charles, Prince William, and Prince Harry, with Meghan, notably and by her own account later revealed as painful, participating only by phone from Canada, where she and baby Archie had already relocated. The Sandringham summit produced a framework agreement in the span of a single afternoon meeting, an almost unheard of pace of decision-making for an institution whose defining historical characteristic had always been deliberate, unhurried, multi-week process on matters of far lesser consequence. The speed of the resolution itself signalled something important. That the institution, having failed for 3 years to successfully contain the risk Meghan represented, was now moving with equal urgency in the opposite direction, toward separation, rather than toward the kind of patient, long-term institutional adaptation that might, in a different set of circumstances, have preserved the working relationship. Accounts of the Sandringham meeting itself, pieced together from multiple sources in the years since, describe an atmosphere of barely contained tension beneath the surface of studied royal composure. William, according to several accounts, pushed for a cleaner, more definitive separation than Harry had initially proposed. Reportedly frustrated by what he and his own advisers viewed as an ongoing pattern of unilateral decision-making from his brother that had already, by that point, generated months of difficult headlines. The Queen herself, 93 years old at the time and having reigned for nearly 68 years, was reportedly the figure in the room most inclined toward finding a compromise that would preserve some ongoing formal role for Harry and Meghan within the institution, a preference that ultimately gave way to the more definitive separation terms that were eventually finalized. The final terms, formally announced later that same month following further negotiation, were stark and, in their specificity, punitive in tone. Harry and Meghan would no longer use their His Royal Highness and Her Royal Highness styles in any official or public-facing capacity, though they would retain the titles themselves privately. They would repay in full the roughly £4 million of taxpayer money that had funded the extensive renovation of Frogmore Cottage, their residence on the Windsor estate, converting what had been presented publicly as a straightforward domestic arrangement into a formal financial transaction. They would step back from royal duties entirely, forfeiting the patronages and charitable associations that had defined Meghan's public role for the better part of 2 years, and that she had, by all accounts, approached with genuine personal commitment. Harry would relinquish his honorary military appointments, a particularly painful concession for a man whose identity had been shaped as much by his years of active combat service as by his royal birth. In March 2020, in the weeks immediately following the finalization of these terms, Harry and Meghan relocated first to Vancouver Island in Canada, where they had already been staying with baby Archie, and then, within several months, permanently to Montecito, California, physically removing themselves from the country whose institution had spent 3 years meticulously managing their public image, and relocating instead to a country and a media environment entirely outside the reach of that institution's established mechanisms of control. The financial dimensions of the separation deserve closer examination because they illustrate the punitive edge beneath the institution's carefully diplomatic public language. Beyond the Frogmore Cottage repayment, Harry and Meghan lost access to sovereign grant funding, the public money that had previously subsidized a portion of their household's official operating costs, forcing them to rapidly construct an entirely new independent financial model in a matter of months. Prince Charles reportedly continued providing some private financial support during an initial transition period through income from the Duchy of Cornwall. But that support was, according to multiple accounts, both temporary and considerably less than what the couple had previously received as working royals. The security question proved even more fraught and remains, as of this telling, a genuinely unresolved and periodically relitigated dispute. The Home Office's Executive Committee for the Protection of Royalty and Public Figures determined that Harry, upon stepping back from official royal duties, would no longer automatically qualify for the same tier of taxpayer-funded UK police protection he had received throughout his life. Harry has since pursued legal action challenging this decision, arguing that his UK-based charitable work and his family's ongoing status as targets of genuine security threats, a status he says has not diminished simply because he no longer performs official royal duties, warrants continued protection when he visits the country. Those legal proceedings have continued for years with mixed results and have become, in their own right, a recurring source of tension between Harry and the institution he stepped back from, illustrating how the original January 2020 separation, far from resolving the underlying friction, simply displaced it into new arenas of ongoing dispute. The distance did not end the story. If anything, it removed the last remaining constraint on what Harry and Meghan were willing to say publicly about what had happened inside the family during those 3 years. A constraint that had, throughout the relationship, been enforced as much by simple geographic and institutional proximity, by the practical daily reality of living inside the system being described, as by any formal confidentiality agreement or explicit threat of consequence. We're getting close to the part of this story that changed the royal family forever, so if you want to be here for it, subscribe now. And tell me, when the Sandringham summit happened, did you think this was a temporary rift, or did you already suspect it was permanent? I want to hear your read on it in the comments. On March 7th, 2021, just over a year after their departure from royal life, Oprah Winfrey's 2-hour primetime interview with Harry and Meghan aired to an estimated audience of over 17 million people in the United States alone, with hundreds of millions more watching in the days and weeks that followed through clips, replays, and international broadcast rights sold to networks around the world. It stands, without serious competition, as the single most consequential piece of media the modern British royal family has ever been forced to reckon with, the moment at which every carefully constructed piece of the containment strategy built more than 4 years earlier. In those 7 quiet months before the engagement was even announced, was, publicly, permanently, and irreversibly undone. The claims made across the interview's 2 hours were, by any measure, extraordinary, delivered by Meghan and Harry with a calm, deliberate specificity that gave the allegations a weight far beyond ordinary tabloid speculation. Meghan described a period during her time as a working royal, particularly following her wedding and the intensifying press scrutiny that followed, during which she was consumed by suicidal ideation severe enough that she seriously considered ending her own life, a disclosure delivered without visible dramatization, in the flat. Careful cadence of someone recounting a genuinely traumatic period of medical and psychological crisis. She said that when she sought professional mental health support during this period, she was told by a senior member of the royal household that the institution could not permit it, out of explicit concern for how her seeking such help might appear publicly and what it might suggest about the institution's own role in her distress. She described in granular detail the isolation of those final months inside the family structure, being denied independent access to her own passport, her own driver's license, and her own car keys, effectively unable to leave the residence unaccompanied, a level of practical control over her daily movement and autonomy that she compared, explicitly and without qualification, to imprisonment. Harry, for his part, described the specific moment he realized the institution was not going to adequately protect his wife, and detailed the financial cutoff the family imposed on the couple once their departure was announced, along with the withdrawal of official security protection, a decision he characterized as having placed his family's physical safety directly at risk. Meghan also addressed directly and for the first time publicly the widely circulated tabloid narrative that had painted her as a demanding, difficult presence who had made household staff cry and had driven a wedge between herself and Kate during the bridesmaid dress-fitting incident discussed earlier in this story. She stated plainly that the reverse was true, that she had been the one reduced to tears by the exchange, and that Kate had since apologized with flowers and a note. The significance of this reversal extends beyond the specific incident itself. It illustrated in miniature exactly the kind of narrative inversion that had characterized so much of the coverage of Meghan throughout her time as a working royal, where negative framings took hold in the press and became accepted public fact long before, if ever, the full context was made available. And then came the single claim that would dominate headlines and public conversation for weeks afterward, eclipsing nearly everything else discussed across the full 2 hours, that during Meghan's pregnancy with their first child, Archie, a conversation had taken place somewhere within the family. Meghan declined, in the interview itself, to name the specific individual involved, though Harry would later confirm publicly that it was not the Queen or Prince Philip, regarding concerns about how dark the baby's skin tone might be once he was born. The claim detonated instantly and globally upon broadcast. It reframed, in a single sentence, the entire public narrative that had been carefully constructed and maintained since November 2016, recasting the story not as one of a family cautiously, if imperfectly, adjusting to a genuinely modernizing moment in its own history, but as an institution whose deep containment instinct, when finally pushed to its absolute limit by sustained crisis, had revealed something the original vetting process had perhaps sensed at some barely conscious level from the very beginning, and had never fully confronted or named directly, that the risk being so carefully managed across those 7 months in 2017 was never really, at its core, about tabloid exposure or press intrusion in the abstract. It was, at least in part, about how much of a mixed race, American, independently voiced woman, and, by direct extension, her mixed-race child, the institution was genuinely willing to fully and unconditionally accept, as opposed to merely, cautiously, and conditionally tolerate. Buckingham Palace's official response, issued 2 full days later under the Queen's own name, ran to just 5 carefully constructed sentences, acknowledging that the family was saddened to learn the full extent of how challenging the preceding years had evidently been for Harry and Meghan, stating that the specific issues raised, particularly those concerning race, were concerning and would be addressed privately by the family, and closing with a single, now famous line insisting that recollections may vary regarding the specific events described. It was, in its extreme brevity and its careful avoidance of any specific rebuttal or admission, almost itself a form of confession, after more than 4 years of managing exposure with elaborate, department-spanning precision, the institution's final public response to its single most consequential public crisis in a generation amounted, in the end, to silence dressed carefully in the language of diplomacy. We're in the final chapter now. If this story has been worth your time, the best way to support this channel is to like this video and leave a comment with your biggest takeaway so far. It genuinely helps this reach more people who care about the real history here. Let's finish the story. Harry's memoir, released in January 2023, sold over 1.4 million copies across its first day on sale in the UK, US, and Canada combined, making it the fastest-selling non-fiction book in recorded publishing history. A commercial reception that spoke to exactly the same global appetite for the real story behind the palace's carefully managed public narrative that this very video is built around, satisfying. The book detailed, among many other things, Harry's account of a physical altercation with William during a heated argument in 2019, Harry's own admission of drug use in his youth, and extensive granular detail about the family's internal communication strategies, including Harry's explicit allegation that royal aides had, at various points, planted or traded negative stories about him and Meghan with the press in exchange for more favourable coverage of other family members, a practice he referred to bitterly as the rota, and characterised as a systemic feature of how the institution managed its collective public image at the expense of whichever individual member was, at any given moment, most useful to sacrifice. In the years since the Oprah interview, the story has continued to unfold in ways that trace back, with striking and almost uncanny directness, to the original 7-month vetting process that began quietly, long before the world ever knew Harry and Meghan were engaged to be married. Harry's 2023 memoir, Spare, ghostwritten with the assistance of acclaimed author J.R. Moehringer and released to enormous global sales and controversy in equal measure, extended the account considerably further, describing in granular, often uncomfortably specific detail the institutional friction that had shaped his entire adult life, the deeply strained and, by his account, at times physically confrontational relationship with both Charles and William, and a family whose default institutional instinct, when faced with a partner who threatened in any way to complicate its carefully managed public image, had consistently been not to adapt or evolve to accommodate her, but to contain, manage, and ultimately, when containment proved impossible, to expel. In the book, Harry described his father Charles as having greeted him, at their first meeting after learning of Diana's death, with an embrace that felt stiff and dutiful rather than genuinely comforting, a small but telling detail that Harry has said in subsequent interviews promoting the book crystallized for him the emotional distance that would come to define much of his relationship with his father in the decades that followed. He described William, in one particularly widely reported passage, physically grabbing him by the collar during a 2019 argument over Meghan, an altercation Harry said left him with a visible mark, though the two brothers later, according to Harry's account, agreed not to speak of the specific incident again. He described feeling, throughout his adult life within the institution, a persistent sense of being cast in the role of the spare to William's heir, a phrase that gave the book its title and that Harry said had shaped his self-understanding from earliest childhood, long before Meghan ever entered the picture. These details, whatever one makes of their accuracy or fairness to the family members described, matter to this story because they extend by years. The timeline of institutional dysfunction this video has been tracing since its opening minutes. The 7-month containment strategy built around Meghan in 2017 was not an isolated incident, born of a unique and unprecedented crisis. It was, according to Harry's own account, simply the latest and most consequential expression of a pattern that had governed his own life and his brother's. Since childhood, an institution that consistently prioritized image management and internal hierarchy over the emotional well-being of the individuals within it. What makes this story different from a simple tale of royal romance gone wrong is the timeline. The instinct to manage Meghan as a risk rather than welcome her as a person did not begin after the wedding, when the pressure of public life had worn the relationship down through ordinary attrition. It began 7 full months before the engagement was even publicly announced, in security dossiers compiled by protection officers who had never met her, in staff reassignments made inside a communications department preparing for a crisis that had not yet occurred. In a closed-door meeting attended by people whose names the public will likely never know, who decided, department by department, line by line, how much of the real Meghan Markle the public would ever be permitted to see, and how much would be quietly, permanently erased before she ever spoke a single word to the cameras as Harry's fiancée. The tragedy embedded in that timeline is not, fundamentally, that the institution failed to predict the eventual rupture between itself and the couple. In many respects, the institution predicted it with uncomfortable accuracy. The original vetting process had flagged, as early as late 2016, nearly every specific point of friction that would eventually surface publicly. The risk posed by Thomas Markle's financial situation and estrangement. The challenge of managing a partner with an independent public voice built over a decade of entertainment, industry visibility. The difficulty of reconciling American directness with British institutional culture. The genuine and largely unaddressed question of how the institution's own history with race would collide with the arrival of its first mixed-race working royal. The tragedy is not a failure of prediction. It is that the institution's own containment strategy, meticulously built over those 7 months and the years that followed, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of public unravelling, may have been the very mechanism that made the unravelling inevitable. By treating the risks it identified as problems to be managed and minimised rather than as genuine institutional challenges requiring authentic adaptation and change. An organisation built over the better part of a millennium around the principle of control. Control of image, control of narrative, control of exactly how much of any given individual the public is permitted to know, applied that same instinctive, deeply ingrained institutional logic to a woman who had spent her entire adult life deliberately and successfully building an independent public voice of her own. The collision between those two forces was never likely to produce anything other than exactly what it eventually did produce: escalating distance, mutual distrust, and eventually, quite literally, an ocean between a fifth-in-line prince and the family he had been born into. The human cost of that collision is, ultimately, what separates this story from a simple institutional case study. It is visible in Meghan's description, delivered calmly and specifically to a global television audience, of suicidal ideation severe enough to require intervention that the institution itself allegedly discouraged out of concern for appearances. It is visible in a father walking his daughter only partway down the aisle at her own wedding, because a containment machine built to prevent exactly this kind of chaos proved unable to control the one variable. A struggling, financially strained parent living outside the reach of palace protocol that it had identified as a risk more than a year in advance and never found a way to actually neutralize. It is visible in a prince who lost his mother to a press pursuit at 12 years old, watching, 2 decades later, a version of that same institutional failure play out again around the woman he loved, and concluding, ultimately, that the only way to protect his own family was to remove them entirely from the country and the institution that had shaped his entire life. Today, Harry and Meghan live a private, deliberately quiet life in Montecito, California, largely disengaged from the formal machinery of the institution that once decided before she had ever spoken a single public word as his fiancée, exactly how much of her the world would be permitted to see. In the years since the move to California, periodic reports of attempted reconciliation between Harry and his family have surfaced with some regularity, generally coinciding with significant royal occasions. Harry returned to the UK for Prince Philip's funeral in April 2021, his first appearance back in the country following the Oprah interview, an event widely reported as tense but civil. He returned again for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations in June 2022, though Meghan's own public role during that visit was notably limited compared to other senior royals. Following the Queen's death in September 2022, Harry and Meghan attended the funeral proceedings and were, in a moment, widely covered by press. Seen walking alongside William and Kate during a public viewing of floral tributes outside Windsor Castle, a brief, carefully observed gesture of unity that generated considerable public speculation about whether it signalled a genuine thaw in relations, though no substantial reconciliation followed in its wake. King Charles's coronation in May 2023 saw Harry attend alone, without Meghan, seated in the third row of Westminster Abbey rather than among the most senior working royals, a seating arrangement that royal commentators widely interpreted as symbolically significant. Reflecting his diminished formal status within the institution following the 2020 separation agreement. He departed the reception almost immediately after the ceremony concluded, reportedly to return to California in time for his son Archie's 4th birthday, a scheduling choice some royal watchers read as a small, telling assertion of where his priorities now genuinely lay. Whether any more substantial reconciliation remains possible continues to be a subject of ongoing public speculation, informed periodically by additional revelations, interviews and documentary projects from both Harry and Meghan that have, on balance, tended to reopen rather than heal the original wounds this story has traced from their very first origins in that quiet 2016 blind date. What remains clear, regardless of how the relationship eventually resolves, is that the pattern established in those first 7 months, containment prioritized over authentic engagement, image management prioritized over genuine emotional connection, proved, over time, to be self-defeating in almost precisely the way a more perceptive, less defensively postured institution might have anticipated and avoided. The wedding the public watched, transfixed on the 19th of May 2018, was real. The love between Harry and Meghan was, by every credible indication available across years of subsequent reporting, memoir, and interview, genuinely real. But the story the palace told about how that wedding came to be, a fairy tale of institutional modernization, evolution, and open-armed acceptance, was never, in fact, the full story. The full story, the one this institution never chose to release, was a 7-month exercise in containment that began